I want to start today with a game. Well, not a game we're going to play right now, but a memory. If you were a board game geek back in the mid 1980s, or, if you just spent a lot of time wandering the aisles of toy stores back then, staring at the boxes you couldn't afford, you might remember a box with this very specific, very terrifying cover art. It was called Fortress America.
Oh, absolutely. That brings back memories. That was part of that Game Master series, wasn't it?
It was.
It sat on the shelf right next to Axis and Allies and Shogun. But Fortress America, I don't know, that one was the dark one.
It really was. It just hit different. Axis and Allies was history.
Yeah.
Shogun was feudal strategy, but Fortress America was a nightmare. The premise is essentially a Cold War fever dream come to life. The box
Oh,
art, it shows the United States, the literal map of the lower 48 being besieged from all sides.
I remember it vividly.
You've got this massive invasion force coming from the west, another massive army just grinding up from the south through Mexico, and then a third striking from the east. And the weaponry was pure 80s sci-fi. I mean, we're talking hover tanks. We're talking satellite lasers raining down doom.
It was designed to tap into that very specific Reagan-era anxiety. And if I recall the mechanics correctly, the gameplay was designed to make the U.S. player feel incredibly claustrophobic.
Exactly. That's the fortress part. If you're playing as the U.S., you start the game completely surrounded. You are alone. There's no NATO coming to save you.
No UN peacekeeping force or anything like that.
Nothing. The invaders, they start with these massive armies, just overwhelming material force. But the game had this really interesting mechanic regarding reinforcements that I think it really speaks to the American psyche.
Right.
The invaders, they start strong, but they don't get many reinforcements later on. They have to win fast. The U.S. player, on the other hand, you start weak. You're just scrambling. But as the game goes on, you start to generate these partisans.
Ah, right. The Wolverines mechanic, the citizen uprising.
Exactly that. Laser towers suddenly pop up in Iowa cornfields. Guerrilla fighters appear in the Appalachian Mountains. The whole idea was that America is this sleeping giant, this impenetrable fortress that even if it gets invaded, it would eventually just grind the enemy down through sheer will, industrial might, and a rifle behind every blade of grass.
It's a really powerful image. And honestly, it's a comforting one in a strange way. It reinforces this deep-seated belief we have, this myth of Fortress America, the idea that we are safe behind our oceans, that the real wars happen over there, and that the homeland is, well, a sanctuary.
But that's the thing. That board game is a fantasy. And I don't just mean the hover tanks.
Well,
I mean the very concept of the fortress itself. Today, we are doing a deep dive into the reality of American defense, and we're finding that the fortress might not be as impenetrable as we think. In fact, one of our key sources today argues it's actually America the Undefended.
And we are going to be looking at a really fascinating stack of documents today. We have an essay by ML Cavanaugh that challenges our entire psychological framework of safety. We have a massive, and I mean a massive, report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that's CSIS, from back in 2006, that lays out the structural crisis in the National Guard and Reserves.
Which is surprisingly relevant today.
Very. And on top of that, we've got specs on the ultimate bunker, Cheyenne Mountain. And we even found a synopsis of a fictional doomsday novel called The Hunters, just to see how pop culture imagines the collapse.
It is a heavy stack. But the mission today is to figure out, are we actually safe, or are we operating on an outdated operating system?
I think outdated operating system is the perfect way to put it, because so much of our defense strategy, our posture, it really relies on what Cavanaugh calls the assumption.
Okay, let's unpack that. The assumption. It sounds a little ominous, like a horror movie title.
It is, in a way. Cavanaugh starts his argument with a really telling anecdote. He submitted an essay to a publication just before COVID hit. In that essay, he mentioned a historical fact about New Zealand. He wrote that New Zealand, or Aotearoa, had been invaded in the mid-19th century during the Colonial Wars, and then it was threatened again by Japan in World War II.
Okay. Seems like a solid historical fact. History is history, right? I mean, what's the issue?
You'd think, but the editor rejected the essay, cut that paragraph entirely. And the reason the editor gave was, and this is a direct quote, "I'm just not convinced that history is relevant to the present."
Ouch. History isn't relevant. That's a bold stance for an editor to take.
It is, but it speaks directly to this mindset. The editor's logic was basically, look, wealthy Western nations don't get invaded anymore. That's old history. That's stuff that happened in the black and white days. We are safe now. That is the assumption. The belief that nightmare scenarios are relics of the past. That the homeland is inherently safe because we are rich and democratic.
And Kavanaugh's argument is that Americans have this assumption really bad, like worse than anyone else.
Because for a very long time, we were right. It wasn't an assumption, it was reality. We have to look at the history of what's called free security. This is a concept from the historian C. Van Woodward.
Oh, okay.
He pointed out that between the War of 1812 and World War II, the United States basically got a free ride on national defense.
A free ride. Security is usually pretty expensive. That doesn't sound right.
Well, just think about the geography. We have the Atlantic Ocean on one side, the Pacific on the other. Those are two massive, massive moats. Nature literally gave us the best defensive certifications on the planet.
Right. While Europe is constantly fighting over borders that are just lines on a map, we're sitting pretty between two oceans.
Exactly. Woodward noted that in the 1880s, U.S. military expenditures were under 0.4% of GDP, not 4%, 0.4. We didn't need a huge standing army because who was going to get to us? We had zero formal allies of any significance, and we didn't need them.
Yeah.
We were isolated, we were insulated, and we were rich.
That sounds nice, actually. Very inexpensive. A kind of golden age of not having to worry about the neighbors.
It was.
Yeah.
But then comes Pearl Harbor, then comes the Cold War, and that paradigm of free security, it just shatters. We realized the oceans weren't enough if planes and submarines could cross them. So we shifted strategies completely. We decided to build fences.
Fences? You don't mean a literal border wall?
No, not literal fences, but strategic ones. We built over 800 overseas bases in 170 countries. The logic was simple. Fight the enemy over there so we don't have to fight them here.
Right.
If the battle is happening in Germany or Korea or Vietnam, it's not happening in Kansas.
That's the classic forward defense posture. Keep the game away from the home court.
Precisely. And for the entire Cold War, that basically worked. We fenced in the Soviet Union. But Cavanaugh's argument, and this is where it gets really interesting for today, is that the fence strategy is now failing. The adversaries have broken free of the fences.
How so? I mean, we still have the bases. The troops are still there.
We do. But the nature of the threat has changed completely. It's no longer just about tanks rolling across the Fulda Gap in Germany. It's about what Cavanaugh calls the strategic knife.
The strategic knife. That's a vivid image. It implies something, I don't know, intimate and precise.
It's the idea that modern adversaries don't need to nuke us to hurt us.
Yeah.
They can use precision strikes, cyber, economic, sabotage to bleed us. I mean, just look at the Colonial Pipeline hack from a few years ago.
Right. That was the ransomware attack that shut down the gas pipeline for the entire East Coast. People were panic buying, filling plastic bags with gasoline. It was absolute chaos.
And that threatened roughly half of all East Coast gas and jet fuel. And that was just a criminal group, likely Russian affiliate. Imagine it was a dedicated state actor.
Yeah.
Cavanaugh points out that Russia has a specific military doctrine for this. It's called SODCIT.
SODCIT. It sounds like a bad cold medicine.
It stands for Strategic Operation to Destroy Critical Infrastructure Targets.
Mm-hmm.
It's literally a plan to use special operations or cyber capabilities to hit power grids, water supplies, financial centers. It's designed to disorient and panic the population.
So instead of invading with hover tanks like in the Fortress America game, they just turn off the lights and drain the bank accounts.
Exactly. They make the civilian population the target, not by bombing them, but by taking away the very things that keep a modern society alive.
Yeah.
And it's not just Russia. The FBI director has called Chinese cyber theft one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history.
And it's happening silently.
Silently, constantly. North Korea has an economy the size of Colorado Springs, yet they can threaten the U.S. homeland with missiles or cyber attacks. The oceans don't stop a line of code. They don't stop at ICBM. The age of free security is gone, but our mindset, that assumption, is still living in the 1880s.
That is a really sobering thought. We're mentally living inside a fortress, but the walls are digital and the gates are just wide open.
And that disconnect is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
As Cavanaugh puts it, we are like a hockey team that has pulled its goalie. We're all on offense, all over there, leaving the net completely wide open.
Speaking of goalies and nets, let's talk about the one place where we did try to build a literal physical fortress. I mean, if we're talking about Fortress America, we have to talk about the ultimate bunker, Cheyenne Mountain.
No, the Crystal Palace.
Yeah.
It is the most iconic symbol of that entire Cold War fortress mindset. You can't not talk about it.
It really is. I was reading through the source material on this, the Wikipedia entry and some archival specs, and the engineering details are just, they're so cool. I mean, there's no other word for it. It feels like science fiction.
It's a true marvel of engineering. It's buried under 2,000 feet of solid granite in El Paso County, Colorado. It was built in the 60s as the Combat Operations Center for NORAD. The whole idea was that this place had to survive a direct nuclear hit.
And how they did it is just wild. It's not just a cave, it's a city inside a mountain. We're talking about 15 three-story buildings.
Yeah.
But they aren't just sitting on the ground, they're sitting on giant springs.
Right, over 1,000 springs, and each one weighs tons. The idea is that if a nuke hits the mountain, the shockwave travels through the granite.
Okay.
If the buildings were bolted directly to the rock, the shockwave would just tear them to pieces. The springs allow the entire city of buildings to bounce. They can move something like an inch or more without breaking the utility connections.
Bouncing buildings inside a granite mountain. And then you have the blast doors. The north blast door weighs 25 tons.
And it's hydraulic. It can seal the complex off from the outside world completely.
It's totally self-sufficient too, isn't it? It has its own power plant. It has these massive water reservoirs carved into the rock. One for drinking water, I think it was 1.5 million gallons. And another one, even bigger, 4.5 million gallons, just to act as a heat sink for the generators.
Because you can't vent the heat easily when you're that far underground.
Exactly.
It's built to survive the apocalypse, which is why it shows up in every movie. War games, obviously.
The original.
Stargate SG-1. They literally put the Stargate in there. That was Stargate Command. Terminator 3, Interstellar. I even saw that Mr. Beast filmed a video there recently. It is the bunker.
But here's the twist, and this goes right back to your point about the assumption changing over time. Cheyenne Mountain isn't the main NORAD command center anymore.
That's right. In 2008, they moved the primary command center to Peterson Space Force Base, which is just a normal above-ground military base.
Wait. They moved out of the indestructible mountain? Why on earth would they do that?
Well, there are two reasons. One is efficiency and money. It's incredibly expensive to run a city inside a rock. But the strategic reason's fascinating. In the early Cold War, the mountain was safe. But as Soviet missile accuracy improved, and as the yield of their warheads went up, we're talking 18 to 25 megaton warheads aimed specifically at that mountain, it became a target. It stopped being a sanctuary and became a giant bullseye.
So the Citadel became a trap.
Exactly. If the Soviets ever launched, they would dedicate massive firepower to crack that nut. So staying there might actually make it harder to do the job of command and control. But, and this is really important, they didn't abandon it. It's now designated as an alternate command center.
A backup.
A backup. And it has one feature that makes it incredibly relevant again today, maybe more than ever.
What's that?
It is the only underground DoD facility certified to sustain a HEMP.
HEMP, like hemp rope.
HEMP, High-Altitude Electromagnetic Pulse.
Ah, okay. That makes a lot more sense.
If a nuclear weapon goes off high in the atmosphere, it creates this massive electromagnetic pulse that just fries electronics on the ground. Most modern facilities, even military ones, are vulnerable to this to some degree. But Cheyenne Mountain, because of that granite shielding and the way it was built, is basically a giant Faraday cage. So in a cyber warfare or EMP scenario, which is exactly what the Hunter's book and the Cavanaugh article warn about Cheyenne Mountain, might be the only place where the lights stay on.
So it went from being a shelter against physical blast waves to being a shelter against electronic death.
Precisely. It perfectly reflects the changing nature of the threat.
Okay, so we've looked at the psychological fortress, the assumption. We've looked at the physical fortress, Cheyenne Mountain. But there's a third fortress, and it's maybe the most important one of all. The human fortress. The actual people we rely on to defend us.
And this brings us to that massive CSIS report, the future of the National Guard and Reserves. This is really where the rubber meets the road. Because while we focus on cool bunkers and advanced missiles, the reality is that our defense strategy relies heavily on the citizen soldier.
And this report makes it crystal clear that the role of that citizen soldier has changed dramatically. I mean, it's been completely flipped on its head.
It's a paradigm shift, as big as the shift from free security to the Cold War. We used to view the National Guard and the Reserves as a strategic reserve.
And what does that mean exactly, a strategic reserve?
It means they were the backup goalie, the break glass in case of emergency force. They were the weekend warriors. You did your 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a summer. The expectation was that you would only be mobilized if World War III broke out.
Okay.
If the Soviets came pouring through the Fulda Gap, then, okay, we call up the Guard. Otherwise, they stay home and do their civilian jobs.
And the report contrasts that with the new model, the operational force.
Right. An operational force is one that is used routinely. They aren't the backup anymore. They are part of the starting lineup. They are integrated into daily global operations. And the data in the report highlights this shift perfectly. In the 1990s, the average number of duty days contributed by the reserve component was about 12.5 million per year.
12.5 million. Okay, I've got that number.
In 2003, after 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq, that number jumped to 63 million.
Whoa. Wait, say that again?
From 12.5 million to 63 million.
That is a five-fold increase. That's unbelievable.
And it didn't really go back down. The report makes the point that the U.S. military simply cannot meet its global demands without the Guard and reserves. It's not a choice. We don't have enough active duty soldiers. The active Army has roughly 14 brigade combat teams available for rotation. But with Iraq, Afghanistan, Korea, the Balkans, and everywhere else we have commitments, the math just doesn't work. They need the Guard to be on the field.
So the whole idea of a weekend warrior is dead.
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
The report talks about the paradigm shift being permanent. This isn't just some temporary surge for a couple of wars. This is the new normal. And that puts an immense stress on the force.
I can only imagine. I mean, if you signed up thinking you'd be sandbagging floods in your home state and suddenly you're doing 12-month tours in the desert, that completely changes the deal you thought you made.
It changes the social compact, which is a term the report uses over and over again. And we see the cracks starting to form. The report notes that in 2005, the Army National Guard missed its recruiting goals by 20%.
20%.
The Army Reserve missed by 16%.
That's huge. That's essentially 1 in 5 soldiers they needed that year but didn't get.
And it's not just general infantry they were short on. They were short on specific critical skills. Civil affairs, military police, truck drivers. These are the people you absolutely need for nation building and logistics.
And there's a cost debate here too, isn't there? Traditionally, reservists were always seen as the cheaper option.
Pay by the yard, right? You only pay them when you use them.
Exactly.
But when you were using them all the time, and when healthcare costs are skyrocketing, that cost gap starts to close. The report mentions that the cost of a busy reservist is getting closer and closer to the cost of an active duty soldier. So the economic argument for relying on the Guard starts to weaken just as the operational necessity strengthens.
It's a real dilemma, and this leads to that acronym the report talks about, ARFGen, Army Force Generation.
ARFGen. It's the model the Army came up with to try and manage this new reality of constant rotation. The goal is to create predictable cycles. For the Guard, the stated goal is 1 year deployed, 5 years home. For the reserves, it's 1 year deployed, 4 years home.
That sounds reasonable on paper. 1 year on, 5 years off. I could see someone signing up for that.
On paper, it's great. It gives predictability to the soldier, to their family, and maybe most importantly to their civilian employer. But the report points out the massive reality gap. To make ARFGen work, you need two things. First, you need units to be fully manned-like, overmanned at 105%, and fully equipped before they deploy. And second, you need a predictable world.
And as we know, the world is rarely predictable.
Exactly. If a new war starts or an insurgency flares up somewhere, that 5 years home can quickly become 3 years or 2. And suddenly, that social compact we talked about is broken again.
And you mentioned being fully equipped. This, for me, was one of the most shocking parts of that entire CSIS report, this section on the equipment crisis.
It's startling. It's a huge contrast. We just talked about the physical fortress of Cheyenne Mountain having everything it needs, right down to the last spare part. But the human fortress, the Guard units, were being systematically hollowed out.
The report talks about this practice of cross-leveling. What is that?
Right. Cross-leveling is a polite military term for robbing Peter to pay Paul. Let's say you have a Guard unit in Ohio that is about to deploy to Iraq, but they don't have enough up-armored Humvees or night vision goggles. So the Army takes that gear from a unit in, say, Pennsylvania that isn't deploying and gives it to the Ohio unit.
Okay, so the Ohio unit goes to war fully equipped, which is good, but the Pennsylvania unit is left with, what? Garages full of nothing.
Exactly, and it gets worse. The Ohio unit then goes to Iraq, and when their tour is done, they often leave the equipment there. It's called leave-behind equipment. The idea is to save shipping costs and ensure the next unit arriving in theater has the gear ready to go.
So the gear never comes home. The Pennsylvania unit never gets its Humvees back.
Correct. The report notes that in late 2005, the Army Material Command was only tracking about 45% of those leave-behind items. They literally lost track of half the gear that was supposed to be passed on.
That is just wild.
And the impact is devastating for the units back here in the States. The report states that non-deployed Guard units in the U.S. had only about 34% of their required equipment.
34%. So if you're a trip driver in a Guard unit in Pennsylvania, you might show up for your weekend drill, And there are literally no trucks to drive.
Exactly. You're simulating training, you're doing PowerPoint presentations about driving trucks, or you're training on old, obsolete gear that looks nothing like what you'll actually use in combat. It creates what the report calls a hollow force.
A hollow force.
Units that exist on paper, they have the people, but they lack the tools to actually fight or do their job.
And this connects back to the tooth-to-tail ratio the report mentions. What's that about?
Right. So the tooth is the combat soldiers, the infantry, the armor, the ones who do the direct fighting. The tail is all the support logistics, HR, cooks, mechanics.
Got it.
For years, the military has been trying to improve this ratio to get more tooth and less tail. One way to do that is converting military jobs to civilian or contractor jobs.
Like, you don't need a soldier in uniform to peel potatoes in the mess hall. You can just hire a contractor for that.
Ideally, yes. But the report highlights the cultural resistance to this. Commanders, they like having soldiers in those roles. You can order a soldier to work 18 hours straight during a crisis.
Sure.
You can't necessarily do that with a unionized civilian employee. But the budget pressure is real. The report cited a $13 billion annual shortfall just for reset and modernization.
$13 billion a year.
That's just to get the gear that's worn out or left behind back to where it needs to be. Without that money, you have these Hulla Brigade combat teams.
Okay, so we have a strained force, we have missing equipment, and we have a massive budget hole. And this, for me, this brings us to the scariest part of the entire discussion, Homeland defense. Because if the Guard is over there fighting the away game and their equipment is left behind in the desert, who is guarding the fort?
This is the core tension the CSIS report identifies. It's the tension between the federal mission and the state mission of the Guard.
Right. The National Guard has two bosses. The president can call them up for war. That's the federal mission. But the governor calls them up for hurricanes, floods, or riots. That's the state mission.
And the report is very critical here. It says the Department of Defense holds the civil support mission at arm's length. They prefer to focus on the away game, on war fighting. But the reality is, when a disaster strikes like Hurricane Katrina, which is mentioned specifically in the report, the governor needs those trucks. The governor needs those soldiers.
But the trucks are in Baghdad, and a lot of the soldiers are too.
Exactly. The report explicitly mentions the equipment shortages during the Katrina response. High water vehicles, communications gear. It wasn't there in the numbers needed because it was deployed overseas.
So we have a situation where the fortress itself is stripped bare to defend the perimeter fences thousands of miles away.
That's the strategic gamble we've been taking. And the CSIS report recommends a solution for this. It suggests creating dedicated civil support forces.
Okay, what would those be?
These would be regional guard units whose primary mission for a set rotational period is catastrophic response.
So for that year, they know they aren't going to Iraq. Their job is to be on standby for a hurricane or a dirty bomb or a massive earthquake.
Correct. And they would be organized regionally along FEMA regions so that if a disaster completely overwhelms one state, the neighboring states can flow in seamlessly with compatible equipment and command structures. It's an attempt to ensure that someone is always minding the store.
But this brings us back to the threat. We talked about the assumption earlier that the big threats are far away, but what if they aren't? We found a synopsis for a book called The Hunters, and it paints a very vivid picture of what happens when that assumption fails spectacularly.
This is a fictional scenario, of course, but it aligns terrifyingly well with the strategic knife concept from Cavanaugh and the EMP vulnerability we discussed with Cheyenne Mountain.
The synopsis describes what it calls a confluence of power. It starts with high-altitude nuclear explosions, 7 of them, going off simultaneously over the country.
That's the EMP attack, the high-altitude EMP. It's designed to fry the national power grid. No electricity, no internet, no transportation. Everything just stops.
And immediately following that, a combined Russian and Chinese invasion. They target military infrastructure with strategic airstrikes.
It's the Fortress America board game, but with modern tactics. The synopsis mentions that this new union, a new global government, clears rural areas and concentrates people in population centers for control. It's a complete collapse of the nation-state.
And interestingly, it mentions that NATO countries launch retaliatory strikes, but the initial damage is already done. The grid is gone. The country is blind and deaf.
Fiction allows us to explore these worst-case scenarios, but if you look at the CSIS report or the Cavanaugh article, the building blocks of that nightmare are real. The reliance on a fragile, interconnected grid, the vulnerability of our critical infrastructure, and the fact that our primary domestic responders, the Guard, might be stretched thin or lacking equipment when an attack like that actually happens.
It's a really sobering comparison. The fiction is dramatic, sure, but the dry government report is almost scarier because it's admitting, in black and white, that we have these significant holes in the armor.
It admits that the social compact is fraying, and that's a key part of the CSIS recommendations. If we are going to ask citizen soldiers to be the linchpin of our entire defense strategy, we have to treat them differently. We have to change the deal.
What does that look like? Fixing the deal, as you put it?
It means money, sure, but it also means support, real support. The report talks a lot about TRICARE, that's military health insurance. There's a huge debate about giving reservists access to military health care even when they aren't actively deployed.
Which seems like a no-brainer if you want them to be deployable at a moment's notice. You can't deploy a soldier who has bad teeth or an untreated medical issue.
Exactly. It's an investment in readiness, not just a benefit. The report also talks about education benefits, specifically allowing soldiers to transfer their GI Bill benefits to their spouses.
That's interesting. Why focus on the spouses?
Because retention is a family decision. If the spouse is unhappy with the constant deployments and the stress, the soldier is much more likely to leave the service. But if the spouse sees a direct benefit like, hey, I can go to college for free because you're serving, they are much more likely to support reenlistment. It strengthens the family unit.
And what about employers? The report mentions protecting students and new hires. If you get hired for a new job and then immediately get deployed for a year, your job needs to be there when you get back.
It's about integrating the military into society, rather than having it be this separate caste that lives on bases far away. If we are truly moving to an operational reserve model, then the whole country has to be part of the fortress. Employers, families, everyone.
There was also a bureaucratic battle mentioned in the report that I found interesting. It was about the chief of the National Guard Bureau.
Right. The question of whether the head of the Guard should be a four-star general and have a seat on the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Does that really matter? I mean, a star is a star, right? How much of a difference does that make?
In the Pentagon, rank is everything. Rank gets you in the room. Rank gets you a seat at the table when the budget pie is being cut up. The Guard has historically felt like the poor cousin to the active army.
Yeah.
They get the hand-me-down equipment. They get cut out of the strategic planning. The CSIS report argues that while the rank matters, what matters even more is creating a culture of partnership versus competition.
They need to be on the same team, not fighting for scraps.
Exactly. If the active army views the Guard as a competitor for funds and missions, they will try to hollow it out. If they view them as an essential partner, which all the data says they are, then they will invest in them and make sure they have what they need to succeed, both at home and abroad.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from the cardboard map of Fortress America to the solid granite of Cheyenne Mountain. We've looked at the history of free security and how it kind of made us complacent.
Yeah.
And we've seen the hard data on how the National Guard has transformed from a backup force to the absolute front line, even as they struggle with equipment and funding and personnel.
It's a very complex picture. We are no longer a fortress in that traditional 19th century sense. We are a global network. Our defense starts in Seoul or Baghdad or in cyberspace. But physically, it relies on people in Ohio and Texas and Pennsylvania.
The moat is gone, the walls are porous, and the defenders are tired.
That is a stark way to put it, but I think it's pretty accurate based on these sources.
So where does that leave us? What is the final takeaway for you, the listener, who is just trying to live your life, assuming the fortress is safe and secure?
I think we have to go back to ML Cavanaugh. He ends his essay with a really provocative thought. He uses an analogy from philosophy, Pascal's wager.
Pascal's wager. That's the argument about believing in God, right?
Right. Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher, he argued that rational people should live as though God exists.
Yeah.
Because if you bet that God exists, and you live a good life, and it turns out you're right, the game is infinite. You get eternal bliss. If you're wrong and God doesn't exist, what have you really lost? Maybe some Sunday mornings, a few vices. The cost is relatively low.
But if you bet against God and you're wrong.
The loss is infinite.
Okay, so how does this apply to national defense?
Cavanaugh applies it directly to Homeland defense. The wager is this: we should invest in Homeland defense, in hardening the grid, in properly equipping the Guard, in robust cybersecurity. Not because an invasion or a total collapse is certain. We don't know if the Hunters scenario will ever actually happen.
But if we bet that it won't happen, and we do nothing, and we turn out to be wrong...
Total loss. The end of our way of life. The collapse of society as we know it. The loss is infinite.
Whereas if we make those investments in defense and nothing bad ever happens,
We've spent some money, we've built some redundant systems, we have a better trained and equipped National Guard that can respond to hurricanes and floods more effectively. The cost is modest, but the potential loss is infinite.
So the rational bet is to stop assuming the fortress is safe and start reinforcing the walls just in case.
Exactly. Are we willing to make that modest investment? Or are we still betting on free security? Are we still hoping the oceans will save us?
Yeah.
Because the data and the history and the current threat landscape all suggest that luck has run out.
It's a powerful thought to end on. It's not about fear-mongering. It's about risk management. It's about, checking the locks on your doors, even if you live in a nice neighborhood.
Precisely.
Thank you for walking us through this. It's definitely changed the way I look at that old board game. And frankly, the way I look at the National Guard Armory down the street.
My pleasure. It's always good to look behind the curtain.
And thank you for listening. We'll catch you on the next deep dive. Stay curious.